Okay, people seemed to like my talk about flags, so I have come back and in a change of topic, I am going to talk about a segment of history. This man comes from U.S. history and is, in my opinion, one of the worst presidents the United States has ever had. Woodrow Wilson, the, well, what is there to say about Wilson except that he screwed this country and ruined race relations for another few decades at the very least? So, Woodrow Wilson is most famous for his presidency during the First World War. And by the First World War, I mean Woodrow Wilson did absolutely nothing during the First World War. Wilson believed in a idea that the United States was the shining city of the hill. He was a subscriber to the concept of American exceptionalism, that America is inherently more moral than nations that had come before and nations that had come after. So when the First World War broke out, Wilson ran on a platform of keeping Americans out of the war because he believed it was a petty European squabble and there was no reason for the Americans to get involved. Now, this might seem like a good idea. There's no reason for an American to die in a foreign conflict we have no stake in. This changed with the Zimmerman telegram to Mexico, in which the German Empire offered Mexicans their land lost in the Mexican-American War if they would join on the side of the Central Powers. Now, realistically, this never would have happened. Mexican governmental officials, Mexican generals, basically told the president of Mexico at the time there was no feasible way it could be done, especially because Mexico was recovering from a civil war or revolution at this time. And anyways, it was enough for the American public to demand war that the Germans would even think about violating their national integrity. So Wilson declares war, and this is in 1917, but because of the time it takes to train an army and the time it takes to sail men across the Atlantic Ocean, Americans really didn't show up until 1918, and at that point, the war was practically over. The British had had a naval blockade on the Germans for the duration of the war, and a serious lack in food supplies had set in across the empire. So it was only a matter of time before the Germans collapsed, whether the US got involved or not. Anyways, because the United States got involved, Wilson pursued his moral policy of, well, it's best exemplified in the 14 points he puts forward, in which he says that the Poles should have their independent nation and that countries that want to be self-governed should be self-governed and all of that. And he also proposes the idea of the League of Nations, which is meant to stop conflict from ever occurring. Now, the League of Nations was never actually part of American history, because when the deal was sent back to Congress, it was never ratified. The Treaty of Versailles was never ratified by the United States, and as such, the United States never joined the League of Nations. So you may be wondering why this Wilson guy is such a bad dude. I mean, what's so bad about him? He kept Americans out of a bloody conflict that was entirely unnecessary, and he proposed ideas of nations having the ability to govern themselves if they should so choose. And he put together the League of Nations, which is while it was a complete failure, it was a good idea. The thing is Wilson didn't have the people's best interests at heart, and his morality was mostly a sham. Ho Chi Minh, who would later fight against the United States in the Vietnam War, approached Wilson during the conferences and asked for American support and independence against France, and Wilson said no. So much for the people should be justified in wanting to seek a government. And I already mentioned that the League of Nations was a complete and total failure. It failed to stop Adolf Hitler, and it failed to stop the war against Ethiopia by the Italians. And there are several world crises that happened under their rule, under their vision. I'm not really under their watchful eye, we'll go with, that they were unable to prevent. As well as this, we need to consider the circumstances of Wilson himself. Woodrow Wilson was born in the Reconstruction South, and because of this, he had a very interesting view on race. And by interesting, I mean abhorrent. Woodrow Wilson was a flaming racist, and this is best exemplified in the fact that Woodrow Wilson gave the honor of the first movie to be screened in the White House to The Birth of a Nation, which, for those of you that may not know, The Birth of a Nation is a Ku Klux Klan propaganda movie that paints the Klan in a very positive light as a defender of American ideas against the Roman Catholics and against the African Americans. So, Wilson's presidency, for the most part, was a total sham, in which he only got by because of very peculiar circumstances. So the predecessor to his presidency was Taft, I believe. And Taft was a progressive Republican and was one of the presidents of the progressive era. Another progressive Republican, was Theodore Roosevelt, and Roosevelt disagreed with Taft on a number of policy issues, And as such, Roosevelt ran for a third term to compete with Taft's second term election. In this split the Republican vote. About half went for Roosevelt and a half went for the incumbent president. And because of this split vote, Woodrow Wilson, despite not having the popular support, managed to get into office. And Wilson's policies from there were incredibly awful to the, let's just say to the black race. Nothing very overtly racist, except entirely overtly racist. I don't mean that Woodrow Wilson was like going out with a shotgun and hunting down black people in the South, but what happened under Wilson's reign was a 180 from the progress that had been made under the Progressive Republicans. Theodore Roosevelt had invited several black men into the White House, and I believe this is the first time it's happened in American history. And he had, well, he wasn't, I'm not going to go so far as to say Roosevelt was like a champion of the blacks. I will say he at least extended a hand to forward their cause. Wilson, on the other hand, did the exact opposite. Woodrow Wilson, basically, despite the whole KKK thing, he was the president that allowed for the federal government for the first time to be segregated. And come on, right? As well as this, Wilson was a historian, right? He graduated from Princeton University, and all of his books on history advocated for the Southern viewpoint of the American Civil War, which is known as the Lost Cause myth. And I use myth because everything in the Lost Cause myth is a twist on truth or an outright fabrication. The Lost Cause promotes the idea that the American Civil War was fought over the issues of slaves' rights or taxation or northern aggression. In reality, the conflict was fought over the institution of slavery. And you will not meet a mainstream historian that disagrees with this fact. Because any historical document from the Confederate States of America, including but not limited to the Articles of Secession from Mississippi and other states, mention explicitly that they are leaving the Union because they believed that the institution of slavery was under attack with President Lincoln's election. So Woodrow Wilson promoted the idea that the southern states fought a righteous war, and they were heroic for fighting a war that they were going to ultimately lose, and that they should be honored as these great men. And under Wilson's rule, the Ku Klux Klan had a resurgence in popularity. For the most part, they had sort of died out. Ulysses S. Grant, who was elected some years after the Civil War, had fought hard to end the Klan in the South and used military force to prevent their activities. But it was Wilson's policies and Wilson's views on race that allowed these white Southerners to continue their reign of terror that would not be properly stomped out until the civil rights movement and the Freedom Summer. And there is still an argument to be made that even to the modern era, it has not been wiped out, and it is still an upward battle. And all of this because of Woodrow Wilson and his lenient policy. So back to more foreign affairs. Woodrow Wilson's idea of a moral nation was something that rubbed the Europeans the wrong way, because both sides knew that the second the Americans entered the war, the other side was screwed, right? So the Germans tried to levy their German immigrant population, as well as the Irish immigrants, to support American intervention on the Central Powers side, and the British tried to levy their growing special connection with the United States to join the Allied side, but Wilson refused because he did not want men to die in a foreign war. And again, it sounds good, right? No one wants their children to die in a needless war. The issue with this, however, and something we know from historical hindsight, is because of his moral stance, Europe didn't like Wilson. And when he paraded into the final treaties, it's just shouting these ideas of like anti-colonialism and self-rule for the Poles and the Hungarians and things like that. They didn't want to listen because this was the man that refused to end the war faster by joining his side. You contrast this to the incredibly pro-war Theodore Roosevelt, who wanted to join in 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania. That might have been 1916. I'm not entirely sure. And you can see why Europeans didn't want to listen to Wilson and why they rubbed him the wrong way. And something else to consider is Woodrow Wilson's policy of not getting involved caused more damage than it did save more lives. By saving a few American lives, he allowed the war to prolong, which made the Germans desperate. And the Germans sent a revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin into the Russian Empire. And Vladimir Lenin is the man that would eventually set up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, who we all know is a champion of human rights abuses and are just a stain on human history. So, as well as this, because the war dragged on for so long, when the war came to a close, France and Britain did not want peace, they wanted revenge. And so they passed a series of harsh laws and harsh treaties that ruined Germany. And because of that, Adolf Hitler was allowed to gain power. The circumstances that led up to uh, Hitler's conquest of Europe were so unique that if history played out again, with anyone but Roosevelt in charge, really, or not Roosevelt, anyone but Wilson, I doubt we would have seen the horrors of the 20th century that humanity was subject to. The things like, well, just the Cold War, World War II, the Holocaust, the Holodomor, all of these could have been avoided if the United States had joined the war a little faster, and that could have been avoided had Woodrow Wilson not managed to sneak his way into the presidency. And that does raise questions who to point fingers at, because do we blame Theodore Roosevelt for splitting the Republican vote? You could. How far back does it go? Or do you blame Wilson for his horrible moral policies when he himself was not a moral man and contributed heavily to the continued existence of racism in the United States? All in all, Woodrow Wilson was not a good president. He was not a good man, and his presidency determined the way the world would go for the rest of the century, and the way that the world went was completely awful. So that is that is my talk on Woodrow Wilson and why I despise him as a man. I honestly think he did nothing positive for the country. I'm pretty sure he did sign in the women's right to vote, but even then I hesitate to congratulate him for that, because that was such a long time coming. Theodore Roosevelt or any sitting president would have been hard pressed to not make that United States law. So I hope everyone has enjoyed my semi-rant about this man that led the country in one of the most turbulent times in history and led it the complete wrong way. And I might make more of these because people seem to be enjoying them. I have I can see my voice, and I notice I get louder over time, I think. I'm very sorry for anybody that's trying to use this to relax, because that seems to be what people use these for. But I hope you've learned something. Please note that this isn't historical research. This is mostly adapted from YouTube videos I have watched. I believe one of them is from a man called Cynical Historian. I could be wrong. But yeah, I don't really know how to end these. So I'm not gonna ask you to like and subscribe or anything, because I don't think this channel has any followers. Also, the program I use to convert voice to video so I could upload to YouTube is a free service, and it keeps track of how many times I've done it. So I might be able to only upload this, and then I'll have to find another way to do it. But until that time comes, I will keep doing these, because I actually kind of have fun just talking about whatever. It's like a little podcast, right? This is dragging on for a while though, so I'm going to end it here. Thanks for listening. Have Have a great day. I don't know how to end these.